Good morning. It is an honor to be here with you today. I am stunned by how many of you are here. It's actually really exciting, as somebody who's been looking at privacy for so long, to see so many people deeply invested in it. And my goal today is to give you a twisted way of thinking about your profession and the challenges you face. So work with me for a moment. So privacy is about control. Right? Most people in the business of privacy think that privacy is about the control of data. Who should access data and under what circumstances? And tech companies build privacy policies to circumscribe access. Engineers build access control structures. People try to communicate what privacy might mean to users. And regulators try to drill into what the implications might be when companies violate this. Yet time and time again, people come back and say, what is wrong with people? Don't they understand privacy? And people will talk about how much they care about privacy, but everybody else complains they don't seem to be doing it right. And it's a really funny thing, because we call it the privacy paradox, right? People's attitudes compared to their actions. And I always found this sort of fascinating, because my life is spending time with people trying to understand what it is that they do. And so for 10 years, I spent time in the trenches talking to teenagers around this country as social media was becoming more and more popular, trying to understand what they were doing and how it fit into their lives. And one of the things I learned really quickly is that they do care about privacy, but they're speaking a very different language than you are. And that disconnect has caused tremendous problems. Now, teenagers talk about their desire for privacy, but what do they mean by it? They actually also talk simultaneously in the same voice about wanting to have access to public life. And that's where the contradiction seems to occur, because they want to share so that they're part of everyday life, and they want to have privacy. So what does that look like? My colleague, Alice Marwick, and I spent all this time trying to untangle that, and we came to something really important. Young people aren't focused on the control of information. They're not focused on the control of access. They're focused on the control of a social situation. Now, that phrase might seem a little weird, right? Because what it comes down to is that they want to know that their interpersonal dynamics will be managed appropriately by the systems as they work through them. They're not really trying to think about it in terms of the information. They're trying to think about what will unfold, how people will interact with them, how they can predict and understand what is going to happen. And that actually has phenomenal implications for a lot of what's going on today. In particular, current crises regarding things like media manipulation. But let me first unpack what it means to control a social situation, because that's actually a really weird thing to think about. So I want you to dial back to middle school, right? I know it was your favorite time ever, right? So think about that time. Think about your friend Carol. And you told Carol something, and you told her not to tell anyone, right? It was a secret. You really wanted to share with her, but you really wanted her not to spread that information. And of course, what did she do? She turned around and she started gossiping, and she spread it to all sorts of other people. And you were embarrassed, and you were horrified, you were mad at Carol. The floor fell out from you because it's terrible to be in middle school and be shamed. It was awful. And you felt like privacy was invaded, trust was violated. But you also learned a really interesting lesson. You learned that if you wanted something to spread far and wide, you should tell Carol not to tell anyone, right? And that's a really interesting lesson, because what you've done is taken a moment of complete horror and turned it around to a moment where you have power, where you can control the situation by understanding the chessboard. There is nothing more empowering than being able to have that control of a social situation, to understand how information will flow, to understand who will say what systems will work. The difficulty is that in a land of technology, having that flow, that understanding, is extremely difficult. And for many people, social media has upended the way in which they can manage control of a social situation. So everyone seems to complain, like you'll hear these complaints, oh my gosh, Facebook violated my privacy. And you're like, what happened? And they're like, they brought this thing I posted 6 years ago back to the present. And Facebook's like, you gave us permission. And people are like, I don't care. That was really creepy. And that's the really important word in all of this, creepy. What you will hear over and over again when people feel like their privacy has been invaded in some way is creepy. And that will have nothing to do with an access violation. That will have to do with how something doesn't feel right. Your parents did something that they shouldn't have done. The social norms were violated. Something went wrong because somebody lost control of a social situation. So I wrote a book, it's complicated, and in it I detail in gory detail, along with other work from my colleague Alice Marwick, what it took and the strategies that young people took during the rise of social media in order to achieve privacy. And it's a really fascinating set of conversations, and if you really want to dive in, I'm speaking again on that topic at 11 o'clock, and there's a book where I can sign it for you, and we can talk about it. But I actually want to connect the dots for you of what that work is that I've been doing for so long with a lot of the work that I'm doing now. Because there was a really interesting shift that happened. Because the fact that we didn't take teenagers' privacy seriously has really hurt us now. And I want to explain what that looks like, because it started at the margins, and it is coming to hurt us in significant ways. Right? Because what happens when you don't give people control over their social situation? They find a way to get control. So I watched a group of teenagers, sort of on the margins, starting around 2004, who were really frustrated by the fact that they didn't have control over social situations. They couldn't stand social media, it made them feel really destabilized, and they wanted control. And like those of you who realized that the key was to share information with Carol so it would spread, these teenagers realized that the information landscape created by social media gave them a new opportunity to control a social situation in a much more mischievous way. Right? And they started by creating memes. It involved lolcats. It was fun. But then they started hacking the attention economy. And it was funny at first. I mean, after years of listening to Oprah Winfrey and other TV people talking obsessively about how the internet was dangerous for teenagers, the idea of getting Oprah to share your message was really funny. So let me explain what happened. She had been doing a series of TV shows about how the internet was filled with online sexual predators, and these teenagers were annoyed because their parents were actually going after them and telling them the internet was unsafe. So they started writing things on her various bulletin boards, trying to contact various people who work on her show. And basically, they engaged in a game that we would now call trolling, right? Because they trolled Oprah's folks, so much so that she spent a half an hour on TV dedicated to a whole culture of online predators that had an icon known as Pedo Bear, and that she talked about on TV about all of these guys who were talking in her message boards about how they were coming to harm children. And she specifically quoted one who says, "He doesn't forgive, he doesn't forget, his group has over 9,000 penises and they're raping children." Now, if you know anything about internet subcultures, well, doesn't forgive, doesn't forget, that's anonymous. Over 9,000 is a meme reference to a Japanese video game, an anime. In other words, it was a massive in-joke within these early environments, a site called 4chan. And she did it. She spoke loud, and you can imagine the internet erupted with laughter, right? It's funny to get Oprah to say ridiculous things. But that kind of youthful media manipulation shifted over time. And media manipulation, it may not seem like it has anything to do with privacy, but actually it's fundamentally rooted in that same dynamic of the ability to control a social situation. Media manipulation allows disenfranchised members of society to come up with alternative ways of controlling, ways of having power after they feel disempowered. And that's a really important component. Because people think about 4chan as a space of anonymity and about people hiding, especially back in those days. But in many ways, it was about purposeful disruption of the status quo. It was about achieving a form of chaos when the status quo was actually undermining any form of agency. And so what happened is this coordinated group of teenagers started to learn how to manipulate media. They learned how to alter structures of information, play SEO games, figure out the very architectures of the system so that they could actually control a social situation in their way. It was supposed to be fun and games, a kind of teen subculture, a joke. Unfortunately, it stopped being funny a couple years ago. So there are many different aspects of media manipulation that I can't go into in 25 minutes, but I want you to realize that this aspect of media manipulation is the control of a social situation, and a lot has changed since what I was seeing in the early aughts. So we've seen sort of this evolution, right? Jokesters messing with Scientology, the rise of Anonymous, the sharing of information through WikiLeaks. We saw people hacking into systems, people getting doxxed, the swarms of people mocking people after someone had died. By 2014, we were seeing the development of sophisticated and coordinated harassment campaigns implemented as media manipulation, implemented as ironic play. By 2015, we were seeing large coordinated efforts to manipulate media for political purposes, in addition to economic purposes. And what ended up happening as we saw all this unfold is the rise of another thing that we saw from early days of Usenet, something that's known as Poe's Law. And you can read what Poe's Law is here, but the really short version of Poe's Law is that online, it becomes increasingly difficult to tell the difference between somebody who is joking around and pretending to be a Nazi and someone who is an actual Nazi. And that dynamic is something that we are living with right now. Charlottesville was a wake-up call for many, but not that much for the tech industry. Not a lot changed. But the violence keeps coming. And I was hoping that I wouldn't have to reference another violent incident this weekend, and yet we did. I want you to understand that the extreme of media manipulation is really about this form and this transition over trying to have control. Because that shifting nature has actually made this turn into something that's far more violent. And the flip side of it is when we talk about privacy is realizing that the technical architectures we're working with are in the business of amplification. And that the news media is also in the business of amplification. And when we have these two systems of amplification that are intertwined, they become something that people can manipulate at scale. So let's talk about Christchurch. 1 month ago, a terrorist walked into a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, and brutally murdered 50 worshippers in a mosque. Okay? And I want you to understand that this incident has 3 parts to it. The first part is that absolute horrific, violent attack that the people of New Zealand had to face. And the consequence to the media and people wanting to cover that and doing what we talk about whenever there is a terrorist attack. But there are 2 other technical components to this that are important. The first is what that particular terrorist did in setting up this attack. This terrorist understood the vulnerabilities of social media, the vulnerabilities of the news media. He knew how to play both of those strategically. So let me explain some of what that looked like. If you read his original 8chan post, you would have noticed something fascinating. He provided live links to absolutely racist manifestos, all sorts of content that was horrific. But the reference to the live stream on Facebook was not a live link. It had spaces between it, and that was intentional. Because that meant that people put the URL into their browser, and Facebook couldn't see that all of the traffic was coming from 8chan. That meant also that he played on the news media by making certain that there were all sorts of references to things that the news media didn't understand, so they would immediately report things. But he had also staged that. Because if you searched for the title of his manifesto, what you got was a stream of horrific content that had been purposefully SEO'd. So you could radicalize a whole set of different people. He did a whole set of other tactics that were very much attempting to undermine any of the detection mechanisms of any major platforms. And that's what occurred before he walked into that mosque, signaled and physically portraying himself as a first-person shooter to get past a lot of original expectations. So much so that the people that I know that do analysis of ISIS videos who watched it live didn't realize what was going on. Now, the third act to it is also problematic because the third act was what happened afterwards. People took that video, that live stream, it quickly went into a variety of different fora. It went to Tor in a matter of minutes. And they kept modifying it and uploading it. Facebook publicly announced 1.5 million uploads. And that was in the first 24 hours. Many services saw many more uploads. And each of those uploads was a modification meant to figure out how to get past all of the content detections. What is this? This is about manipulating vulnerabilities in the information landscape. And you may recognize that that language is a language of security. Right? Exploits, vulnerabilities, hacking. In privacy circles, we've long talked about the relationship between privacy and security, talking about what it means to think about the ability to access private information, about controlling and building the secure structures to control data. But I want you to rethink what it means about the relationship between security and privacy when we talk about an information landscape, when we talk about the ability to control a social situation. In order to secure an information landscape where people are trying to manipulate the social context, we need to recognize that data becomes infrastructure. And the idea that you end up having here is not simply that you want to exploit it by actually accessing the data, but by corrupting the data, right? Actually making it difficult for any system to operate because you can do a lot of things that we've often thought of as separate. Search engine optimization, algorithmic gameplay, all of the different ways of contorting recommendation engines in search. But what happens is that because the data that people put in through the front door and the kinds of models that get built off of the variety of different sources of data become so powerful, the way in which you control a situation is that you exploit the underlying infrastructure. You exploit the data that builds the models. And that's what we see people doing on a regular basis. You know, as we think about our current obsession with data, we're not just thinking about how we can actually follow compliance rules. And I'm so grateful for those of you who've worked so hard in this room, both to make certain that GDPR is a reality and to make certain that it could be implemented in a variety of different ways, because we want to give people control over their information. But it's not enough. Because you can give them control over their personal information, but if you don't actually secure and protect the data that actually builds the models, the data that builds our information landscape, you end up with a new kind of vulnerability amongst those who want to control a social situation. You know, I don't know, how many of you have ever read Snow Crash? So those are the geeks in the room, say hi to them. Snow Crash is a really interesting book. For those of you who have not read it, I strongly recommend it. Because it was basically the Bible of tech culture in the late 90s. And when I was in the industry as an engineer, I was intrigued by how many people, you couldn't go into a meeting without somebody referencing what they wanted to build from the world in Snow Crash. And they were so excited. They were like, this is what we're going to build. The metaverse is the solution to everything. The metaverse is basically like, what would you imagine when you fully came into the internet, right? All of the immersive environment conversations. The problem with it is that Neil Stephenson's book is a dystopian novel. It's not a utopia. He argued what it would mean to build these complex information landscapes, many of the things that our engineers have designed for. But the whole book, the title, is rooted in the idea that there is a virus that will spread, that will fragment society by making it impossible for them to communicate, the collapse of the Tower of Babel. Right? And the whole point of this is that if you connect everybody, there will be new exploits, and those exploits will actually go into the vulnerability of the human social fabric. And I want you to read this book when you go home. It's fun. There's even a good audiobook. So that you can actually understand where we designed for and what the implications are for now. But I want to talk about what that is right now, because it's not just an exploit of a terrorist. It's an exploit that's actually happening on a more everyday basis. So epistemology is a concept that says, how do we know what we know, right? How do we build a set of knowledge? How do we construct it socially? How do we have competing and different epistemologies? And in those frames, the idea is that ignorance is what we don't yet know, right? But there's another way to actually think about ignorance. Ignorance can be strategically manufactured. And in fact, in 1995, Procter & Bowl coined a term called agnotology. And agnotology is the idea that you can strategically enable ignorance. You can make ignorance happen by making it difficult to tell what is reality, by seeding doubt, by just asking questions about whether or not there is really a climate problem, whether or not there's any link between tobacco and cancer, whether or not, as CNN put out, a racist epitaph saying something like, "Are Jews really people?" Those frames are ways in which you can seed ignorance. You can seed ideas of horror. And they've been used politically for quite some time. Russia today has been engaged in a coordinated campaign for many years, trying to say, asking questions. And the whole program's called Question More. So for those who can't read this, it says, just how reliable is the evidence that suggests human activity impacts on climate change? The answer isn't always clear-cut. It's only possible to make a balanced judgment if you are better informed. By challenging the accepted view, we reveal the side of the news that you wouldn't normally see, because we believe the more you question, the more you know. That's a way of seeding agnotology, seeding ignorance, creating fractures within society. And people who are engaged in doing so feel power. They feel as though they can control information by actually, in many ways, corrupting the information landscape. Many of the reasons that people get into privacy is because they recognize that privacy is connected to user trust. We realize when we build systems that we want our users to trust what we're building, to have confidence in us. And we are in a situation in this industry where the companies that have been struggling around this are struggling with the ability to communicate and engage people on trust, because they don't know how to actually help people understand that they can have control over a social situation. I'm really proud to be at Microsoft because Microsoft has actually put privacy and trust at the center of things. And I'm not saying the company has always done it right, but really making that commitment and making that part of your values is really essential to me. And it's one of the things we need to be doing collectively, because one of the things we're dealing with is it's not just about whether or not we can fill the compliance, but can we actually find a way through this industry to rebuild trust? And that's going to require us to really deal with the issue of creepiness. And right now, I would argue we're not doing it, because we're not actually starting from a place of values. We're not starting from a saying, like, we are going to put the user center. We're still struggling to understand what we all mean, and we're thinking that we can do this in a technical form. And what I'm saying is that there isn't a technical solution through this. This is a set of processes and practices and understanding, like with security, that the vulnerabilities will keep coming. So fundamentally for me, it's unacceptable that the technical skills and economic power allow people to exploit systems. And we need to recognize that those exploitations around privacy are connected to the other forms of security, and that the very nature of security is evolving. But fundamentally, it comes back to this question of what are we trying to protect? In the tech industry, we often talk about the right to speak, but it's actually kind of evolved into a weird way of the right to be amplified. And we don't know how to deal with that tension at all. We don't know how to deal with what it means to reclaim control over social situations because we don't have a framework of power. Well, actually, some of our favorite people in the history of privacy do have a theory of power and a pathway through this. I have to imagine that most of you know and perhaps love Brandeis. I certainly do. Well, when Brandeis and Warren penned their famous article on the right to privacy, they built an argument around involuntary disclosure and how it harmed people. But the thing is, they've also argued the other things throughout Brandeis' career. So you may also know his essay where he argues that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Because the point of that was that you actually have to purposefully expose systems of power in order to make a difference. And at some level, they seem contradictory, but they're not. Because they actually can be understood as a way of seeing how he started to model the role of power across the information landscape 100 years ago. And the case that I actually find the most interesting is one that is not usually discussed in privacy conversations. It's the 1932 case known as Packer versus Utah. And in his opinion in this, he laid out a true theory of power that allows us to unlock some of the challenges and connects the dots between privacy and these kinds of manipulations. So the case was that Utah outlawed smoking ads, tobacco ads, on billboards. And Packer Corporation sued under the First Amendment, saying that they should have the right to post on this. Why could they not put anything up? And Brandeis, wrote the opinion as a member of the SCOTUS, and he said that actually a billboard is different than a magazine. A billboard is part of a public sphere, and a magazine you can choose to buy or not buy. And that if you put it in the public sphere, you will force people to have to divert their eyes. And to do so would be creating captive audiences. And captive audiences for him was a way of actually looking at the power differential. And if you start to build this through, you see that there's a way through, legally, socially, and culturally, through understanding the power dynamics. In other words, the commitment to speech, the commitment to First Amendment, is about giving people the right to speak, but not necessarily the right to be amplified. Certainly not when that amplification can harm people. So as we think about privacy going forward, we want to actually converge privacy through that theory of power. By focusing simply on the technical access issues, we lose visibility. By focusing on the individual, we lose the structure. Privacy needs to actually understand that privacy is going to be networked going forward. It is part of a broader social fabric, and we need a framework that allows us to see that the manipulation of systems is a way of exploiting privacy at the interstitials between people. Privacy can't simply be about the individual because it won't give us the tools to actually deal with the power dynamics. And when speakers and amplifiers have the unchecked power to turn a blind eye to the cost of harm, what's at stake for all of us is privacy, dignity, democracy, and social cohesion. So I am deeply grateful for all of you doing privacy work, and I'm excited that you're going to get to spend some time together really thinking through this. And my hope in offering this up to you today, aside from going into a dark place, is to actually give you a way of thinking about and complicating your own views of what's going forward. And I look forward to talking with you more across the day, and thank you for your time.